I hope you've had a chance to look at our program brochure or our website and to see the lively and varied events that we're offering this year under the topic of adaptations. This series has been curated by Warren Breckman, my colleague in the history department here at Penn, who will be introducing most of the speakers this year, who are some of the most influential and out-of-the-box thinkers in all the fields of the humanities and the adjacent areas of art and science. Our speakers will be explaining in new ways the role of adaptations in the acquisition of language, in the creation of religions, the crises of capitalism, the emergent forms of cinema, the history of opera, the politics of feminism, and more. It's a great series, and I hope to see many of you at these events throughout the year. Now, this particular event today relates to our theme of adaptations. It's something of a tangent. We mainly wanted the opportunity to hear Paul Hendrickson talk about his wonderful book and to participate in its launch. We at the forum can't exactly take credit for Paul, but we do have some history together. The inspired arrangement that originally brought Paul Hendrickson onto the Faculty of English at Penn was brokered by my colleague Wendy Steiner. Where'd you go, Wendy? Wendy Steiner, who, and it was really just at the same moment that she was beginning to work on organizing what would shortly become the Penn Humanities Forum. The inaugural series of the forum, the Celebrating Philadelphia Writers Series, involved Paul as a participant. And a few years later, when he completed his magnificent book, Sons of Mississippi, which won him the National Book Critics Circle Award, among other laurels, Paul came and gave a wonderful, passionate, beautiful address to a packed house for the forum at that time. So while the arrival of this new book by Paul Hendrickson is a matter of wide excitement throughout the literary world, you may have seen already the reviews that are coming in so glowing, not to mention among his many colleagues, students, and friends around the campus, especially in the English department and at Kelly Writers House. It also does have a special and kind of intimate importance for us here at the Humanities Forum, which is simply to say that even if our theme this year had been tribalism or space travel, we would have wanted to lead with Paul Hendrickson and Hemingway's boat. But actually, now that I've read it, I do think that among his other achievements in the book, Paul has pulled off a neat trick of generic adaptation. He's restructured the conventional literary biography around a very unconventional object of focus, not simply the author, not the author's work or the author's relationship to his work, not the author's family and friends or his relationships to them. All of that is in there, of course. The book is about these matters, but all of that is pivoted and articulated to revelatory effect around this unlikely thing, this decaying object, a boat. Maybe even, as Paul can explain, a bogus boat, as someone calls it. All Hendrickson's skill and doggedness as a researcher, honed during his 20 years at the Washington Post, and his immense talents as a writer are evident in Hemingway's boat. And so, too, are his even rarer gifts, well known to all his friends and students here, his moral decency and his great generosity of spirit. Against the rather tired backdrop of professional Hemingway studies, this book stands out in pure splendor. Please join me in welcoming our own Paul Hendrickson.
Gee, even if it had been tribalism or space travel, I would have tried to talk Jim into allowing me to come here, even though I know nothing about tribalism and space travel. Thank you all for coming this evening. And there's always so many competing events on a campus like this, and I'm grateful that you came from inside the campus and from outside it. If you'll allow me, I would like, first of all, to say some thank yous, just because it feels very necessary. First, to Jennifer Conway and Sarah Varney. These are the people who really make the Penn Humanities Forum such a success each year. It's all the behind-the-scenes work that it takes to produce one of these events. Jim couldn't possibly remember this, but the first office I ever borrowed in the spring of 1988 on the third floor of the old Bennett Hall was his office. He was on leave. I was riding a train up one day a week from Washington, D.C. I was squatting, gypsying around, and somehow or other I was able to use his office. I never did figure out how to turn on his computer. I remember something about a bicycle in that office. I would like also to thank Wendy Steiner, Jim's predecessor as the founding director of the Penn Humanities Forum, and indeed a former chairman of the English department, just as Jim himself is a former chairman of the English department. Wendy literally was my first patron at Penn. I once wrote her an interminably long letter with no resume on an electric typewriter one morning in my basement in Tacoma Park, Maryland, before I went off to my desk at the Washington Post. She, about a week later, had Lisa New, who was then the undergraduate chairperson and who's now at Harvard University. She had Lisa call me up and say, Mr. Hendrickson, we got your rather interesting and detailed letter, and we think we might be interested in following this up. And I said something like, oh, good, I'll be up on the next train. I'd also like to thank Nancy Bentley, who is the chair of the English department currently and a co-sponsor of this event, who has always treated me with a lot of dignity and graciousness, and in fact all members of the English department, where I very happily am housed now in my own beautiful office on the second floor. I'm very grateful to be a resident there of Fisher Bennett Hall, and I'm very grateful for the snatches of hallway talk with such learned, esteemed scholars. I'd also like to say thanks to the various folks in Penn's creative writing program and at Kelly Writers House. That's my true spiritual home on this campus. My good friend, my beloved friend, Greg Janickian, the director of creative writing, is here tonight. As I have described Kelly Writers House, it's that little woody, green-trimmed Victorian dream set back from Locust Walk on the upper campus. My students, I need to shout out to you. This, in fact, is the first fall since the year 2000, when I began at Penn full-time, that I haven't taught. And though I'm quite happy in one sense to be free of you little Ivy snot noses, the truth is, I can't deny it. I miss you terribly, and I'll see you in January. Jonathan Siegel, my book editor at Alfred Knopf, who made the trip here to be here this evening. This book, Hemingway's Boat, is dedicated to John. We have been together 32 years. Nothing lasts 32 years without its struggles. But he is a brilliant editor, and I think I knew before I wrote my first line that I would dedicate this book to him. And he was accompanied down this evening by Michelle Summers, who is the publicity manager of Knopf and Pantheon, which are divisions of Random House. And Michelle has worked so hard to get the word out on this book and is brilliant at her work. There are some esteemed medical doctors in this room tonight, and I'm honored that you would have taken the time to come over. But mostly, and lastly, my family, starting with my spouse. As I said in this book's acknowledgments, Seal Moffat Hendrickson was the true sustainer who listened to the fears and the doubts day and night through all the years of doing it, my partner. But also, to my huge surprise, about 15 minutes ago, my son Matt and his new fiancée, Jenny, arrived quite by surprise. They had it all plotted out from Washington, D.C. They were engaged 3 weekends ago on Hurricane Weekend. No hurricane was going to stop my son from having an outdoor engagement at Washington Nationals ballpark. It's all on video. The video went viral. All you need to do is go home and Google Matt Hendrickson engagement. That's the true work of creative endeavor, not Hemingway's boat. But he's not up here. I am, so I'd best damn get on with it. Thank you, and thank you for suffering through those acknowledgments. In the spirit of adaptation, I would like to adapt some of my own words from Hemingway's boat tonight, and I will speak for 35 or 40 minutes tops, and that'll be more than enough. I've just set my watch out in front of me. As Jim said elegantly in his introduction, the watery book that I have been working on for roughly the last 7 years, and that has taken me from Havana to Key West, to Oak Park, Illinois, to Idaho, to northern Michigan, and to a lot of other watery and non-watery points in between, isn't meant to be Hemingway biography, not in any conventional sense. We've had far too many biographies in the past 50 years, not to say daffy critical studies and even daffier psychological explanations, quote, of the man. The work has been trying to come to a modest understanding of the almost insanely complicated life of Ernest Hemingway through the narrative lens of something in the material world he had loved very much, a possession that was intimately his and he hers for 27 years, which were his final 27 years. Her name was Pilar, and she was his 38-foot seagoing motorized fishing vessel, and she lasted him through 3 wives, the Nobel Prize, and all his ruin. He owned her, fished her, worked her, rowed her from the waters of Key West to the Bahamas, to the dry Tortugas, to the north coasts and archipelagos of Cuba. She wasn't a figment or a dream or a literary theory or somebody's psychosexual interpretation. She was actual. Onto her varnished decks, hauled in over her low-cut stern on a large wooden roller, had come uncounted marlin and broadbill swordfish, tuna, sailfish, kingfish, snook, wahoo, tarpon, horse-eyed jacks, pompano, dolphin, barracuda, bonito, and mako shark, which, as Hemingway once said, are the ones that smell oddly sweet and have those curved-in teeth that give them their Spanish name, dentuso. This factory-made craft, sturdy, faithful, humble, by 30s yachting standards humble, became the structural prism and storytelling device and organizing principle through which I searched for the man himself. If I've spent some 7 years writing Pilar in my head as metaphor and motif and narrative vehicle, would that I could have had one real ride on her and felt her under me in a wholly different way. I say 7 years, but in truth, I think the origins of this book go back at least through 3 decades and 4 intervening books. To explain just a bit of that, in early 1980, on the island of Bimini, when my wife and I were in weekend escape from the snows of Washington, D.C., I encountered Ernest Hemingway's little brother, Les Hemingway, 16 years his junior, whom he used to call the Baron when he was being kindly to him. The Baron, in his mid-60s, was sort of a failed man. Who could ever live under the shadow of the Hemingway volcano? And yet, a very nice guy. He told me some incredibly sad family stories that weekend. So maybe this is where the idea first seeded itself. I don't really know. Maybe I don't want to know. You see, I've long believed that our writing projects find us, not we them, and sometimes the finding can be a half-alert thing winding on for years. What we need to do is be grateful. Hemingway's boat is largely the story of the span of time between the first week of April 1934 and the first week of July 1961. But the narrative doesn't always stay there. No human history ever proceeds in a straight line, perhaps least of all Ernest Hemingway's. His prose was wonderfully rooted in geography and linear movement, but his life, like his boat, beat against so many cross currents. It's about the strange, sad distance from a Brooklyn boatyard named Wheeler Shipyard, Inc., to a tight, oak-paneled entryway in a bunker-like house in Ketchum, Idaho, when the world went away from a suffering man in fractions of a second. My aim has been to try to lock together the words Hemingway and boat in the way that the locked together and equally American words DiMaggio and bat or Satchmo and horn will quickly mean something in the minds of most people, at least of a certain age. It's about such ideas as fishing, friendship, and fatherhood, and love of water, and what it means to be masculine in our culture as that culture is now rapidly changing, and the notion of being boat-struck, a malady that seems to affect men more than women, and how the deep good in us is often matched only by the perverse bad in us, and not least about the damnable way our demons seem to end up always following us, even when we think we've escaped them and are out cruising on the stream. The Gulf Stream, that belt of deep blue water, which Hemingway thought of almost mystically as the Great Blue River. In late May of 2005, I went to Cuba to see the stream for myself, but more importantly, to behold, in the flesh, so to speak, Hemingway's boat. She was sitting up on concrete blocks like some old and gasping, browned-out whale, maybe 100 yards from his house, under a kind of gigantic carport with a corrugated plastic roof on what was once his tennis court, just down from the now drained swimming pool where Ava Gardner had reportedly swum nude. Even in her diminished, dry-docked, parts-plundered state, I knew Pilar would be beautiful, and she was. I knew she'd be threatened by the elements and the bell tolls of time in the same way that much else at the hilltop farm on the outskirts of Havana, La Finca Vejia was its name when he lived there, was seriously threatened, and she was. But I didn't expect to be so moved. I walked round and round her. I took rolls and rolls of pictures of her long, low hull, of her slightly raked mahogany stern, of her nearly vertical bow. When the guards weren't looking, I reached over and touched her surface. The wood, marbled with hairline fissures, was dusty, porous, dry. It seemed almost scaly. It felt febrile. It was as if Pilar were dying from thirst. It was as if all she wanted was to get into water. But even if it were possible to hoist her with a crane off of those blocks and to ease her onto a flatbed truck and to take her away from that steaming hillside and to set her gently into Havana Harbor, would Hemingway's boat go down like a stone, boiling and bubbling to the bottom, her insides having been eaten out long ago by termites and other barely visible creatures? A man who let his own insides get eaten out by the diseases of fame had dreamed new books on this boat. He had taught his sons to reel in something that feels like Moby Dick on this boat. He had accidentally shot himself in both legs on this boat. He had fallen drunk from the flying bridge on this boat. He had written achy, generous, uplifting, poetic letters on this boat. He had propositioned women on this boat. He had hunted German subs on this boat. He had saved family members from shark attack on this boat. He had acted like a boor and a bully and an overly competitive jerk on this boat. He could make her do 16 knots at full out, and he could make her cut a corner like a midshipman in Annapolis. When she was up and moving, her prow smartly cutting the waves, it was as if she had a foaming white bone in her teeth, which is an expression that old seamen sometimes use. When he had her loaded for a long cruise, she would hold 2,400 pounds of ice for keeping cool the Hatui beer and the daiquiris, the avocados, and the Filipino mangoes. He had named her after a shrine in a feria in Spain that commemorates Nuestra Señora del Pilar. But his boat's name was also meant to commemorate the secret nickname adopted by his second wife, Pauline, before she was his wife, when the two were still in adultery. It was the name he would have given a daughter, he once said, if he'd ever had been blessed enough to have a daughter. Pilar could fit 6 in her sleeping compartments, 2 more in her open-air cockpit with its roll-down canvas sides and copper screens for warding off the nighttime bugs. In her prime, she had been known among Gulf Stream anglers for her shiny black hull, for her seafoam green canvas roof and topside. A boat with a black hull riding long and low in the water can be very hard to sight against a glaring tropical horizon. So yes, something almost ghostly. He used to love standing up on his beauty's flying bridge and guiding her out of the harbor in the morning light. Sometimes he'd be bare-chested. The flying bridge was his name for a top deck, and it wasn't added until 1937, just before he left for Spain to report on the Spanish Civil War, and not unconsciously to find a hugely successful novel about it. The sport fisherman in his raggedy and beltless shorts, or if he was wearing a belt, putting it not inside the loops but over top of them, would have his tanned, muscular legs planted several feet apart like a heavyweight braced for a roundhouse, or a golfer ready to slam his tee shot. He'd have his white visor pulled low over his blistering nose that was coated with zinc oxide or glazed with coconut oil. And now, Hemingway's boat sat beached and grime-coated and time-stunned in the Cuban sun. When he got this boat, or more precisely, when he placed the order for her and put down $3,000 toward a full purchase price, courtesy of a hastily arranged loan advance from the editor of Esquire magazine against future articles. It was April 5th, 1934. He was just back from safari in East Africa, having come triumphantly into New York Harbor the day before on the SS Paris. Ernest Miller Hemingway, right then, was not quite 35 years old. He was still living and writing in Key West, a sand-bitten and depression-sagging outpost at the bottom of America. He was rugged, handsome, youthful, trim-waisted, owner of a killer grin and an even more killer ego, the reigning monarch of American literature, a sportsman and a sensualist, glorying in his life in the external physical world. And when he lost Pilar, in that moment when he lost everything, on a summer Sunday in 1961, in a place where the mountains outside his 3-picture windows in the living room were as jagged as the teeth of a shredding saw. He was 19 days shy of his 62nd birthday, prematurely old, multi-diseased, mentally bewildered, delusional, slurred of speech, in exile from Cuba, from the stream, displaced by Fidel's revolution, unable to compose so much as one true sentence a day, or so he had wept on a sofa in his Ketchum living room. Is it any wonder the most imitated writer of the 20th century rose sometime after 7 o'clock that morning, slipped a red silk dressing robe over blue pajamas, put on slippers, moved past the master bedroom where his 4th wife was sleeping, went down the red carpeted stairs, crossed the length of the living room to the kitchen, retrieved the key to the locked storeroom where the weapons were, went down to the basement, took shells from an ammo box, closed and relocked the door, came back upstairs, walked 10 steps to the front entry foyer, opened the entry foyer door, stepped inside, placed the butt of the gun on the linoleum tile, tore open the breech, slammed in the cartridges, snapped it shut, bent over, as you might bend over a water fountain, rested his forehead against the blue steel, and blew away his entire cranial vault with the double-barreled 12-gauge Boss shotgun with which he had once shot pigeons. I am not a career Hemingway scholar. I am not a true academic, however grateful I am to be hiding out in the groves of academe. The book I have written isn't trying to be literary criticism. It's a story. It's what I was able to do, proudly. But as a matter of fact, it's one of my beliefs that even if you are a true and even career Hemingway scholar, you still have to pick your reading spots with Hemingway. There's too much of him. And by that I mean too much depth sounding of human nature and emotion in him. He's too ready to bend around and detonate all your preconceptions. I think of a deceptively simple story like Big Two-Hearted River, which he wrote as a very young man in 1924, sitting at those legendary marble-topped tables in Montparnasse. I suppose I have read it more than 30 times, starting back in high school, half a century ago, when I was a student for the priesthood. And each time, the story puts something new in me, brings me a little deeper into the swift, dark undercurrents of the story. I know it's not quite true, but I like to think of modernism as starting right there or here. On the surface, big two-hearted river is just a very long, short tale in two parts about a young man named Nick Adams on a camping trip in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But no matter how happy he is to be off by himself in the woods with his tent and fly rod and cans of pork and beans, he seems vaguely troubled about something. Not that the author ever says that. The word war is not present. But you somehow begin to feel such things and a lot more besides, almost from the opening sentence, which speaks of something burnt and going away. Hemingway used to say that one of his core writing values was trying to, quote, make the reader feel more than he necessarily understands. He once articulated it as the theory of omission, that what you leave out can be far more important than what you put in. He said that the dignity of an iceberg derives from the fact that 7/8 of it are underwater. Ernest Hemingway has been examined by so many scholars and memoirists and respected biographers and hangers-on and pretenders and doctoral students desperate for a dissertation topic that I feel sometimes we have lost all sense of who the man really was. It's as if each new Hemingway book by each new Hemingway expert, in quotes, wishes to contradict the last, which is one reason why I was determined to try to anchor a Hemingway narrative, to ground it, journalistically you might say, in something that had existed in the material world, that still did exist after a fashion. I felt if I could somehow learn whatever was possible to learn about an object that had meant so much to him, if I could actually touch it, say when the guards weren't looking, I might be able to understand things about Hemingway, and not only Hemingway, in ways I had not previously been able to understand. Indeed, I hope to find people who were once on that boat, who had had their own deep relationship with her, and to try to tell their stories too. And I did find them, both the living and the dead. In the summer of 1987, as a Washington Post reporter, I searched out and interviewed Hemingway's 3 sons. Perhaps by then a book or an idea of a book was struggling to get up above ground. I don't really know. The 9,000-word 2-part series was called Papa's Boys. Their father had been dead for 26 years, and the sons themselves were late middle-aged men. What I recall so vividly about Jack and Patrick and Gregory Hemingway in their deep psychic sibling pain was their attempt to say how fine it had been to spend time with their father outdoors, in Idaho meadows flushing quail, in the stream going for the monsters, in high Wyoming creeks fighting rainbows. No one could ever take those feelings and experiences away. Past all of their father's posing and public brawling, past all of his posthumous critical whittling down, past all of the intentional and unintentional psychic hurt he had inflicted on them, what each Hemingway son still possessed was the memory of the man when the man was good. Gregory Hemingway, the youngest, the most deeply scarred of the 3, the most gifted athlete in the family, the one with the truest writing gift, the son who had been given the nickname Gigi by his father, had grown up to be a medical doctor, like his paternal grandfather, Gigi had also spent most of his adult life struggling, heroically seems not too strong a word to me, against the compulsion to dress up his squat, bulky body in hosiery, brassieres, wigs, girdles, makeup, spiked heels, fingernail polish, and then go out into public places talking to people in his deep-chested voice. He was 55 and in the Miami area when we met. Coarse gray hair fell in clumps over his face. His teeth were wrecked. He was spending his days in public parks and libraries. He had no fixed address. He had been married and divorced several times. He was estranged from most of his children, and he had 8. The medical career had drained away. Sometimes, he said, he would go out onto Biscayne Bay in a small rowboat to hand fish over the side with a night crawler and fall asleep in the sun until something below jerked him awake. Gigi said, and it was easy to believe, that he had undergone 98 electroshock treatments. "I've taken every fucking pill there is," he said softly. These horrible, mixed up feelings you have, the love and the hate, he said. If Gigi was the son who disappointed Hemingway the most, he was also the son whom Hemingway forsook the least. I believe that both of them, the one who exploded himself into infinity and the one too long regarded as the genetic blunder of the Hemingway family, were far braver human beings than we ever knew. I have come to believe deeply that Ernest Hemingway, however unpostmodern it may sound, was on a lifelong quest for his sainthood, and not just literary sainthood, and that at nearly every turn he defeated himself. How? Quote, by betrayals of himself and what he believed in, end quote, as the dying writer with the gangrene going up his leg says so bitterly in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, one of Hemingway's greatest short stories. Why the self-defeating betrayal of high humanistic aspirations? The seductions of celebrity and the sin of pridefulness and the curses of megalomania and the wastings of booze and not least the onslaughts of bipolarism must amount to a large part of the answer. Hemingway once said in a letter to his closest friend in the last 2 decades of his life, General Buck Lanham, whom he had come to know on the battlefield as a correspondent in World War II. Buck, I have always had the illusion it was more important, or as important, to be a good man as to be a great writer. May turn out to be neither, but would like to be both. I also believe there was so much more fear inside Hemingway than he ever let on, that it was almost always present, by day and more so by night, and that his living with it for so long was ennobling. The thought of self-destruction trailed Hemingway for nearly his entire life, like the tiny wakes a child's hand will make when it is trailed behind a rowboat in calm water, say up in Michigan. Many years ago, Norman Mailer wrote a sentence about Hemingway that has always struck me as profound. Said Mailer, it may be that the final judgment on his work may come to the notion that what he failed to do was tragic, but what he accomplished was heroic, for it is possible that he carried a weight of anxiety within him from day to day which would have suffocated any man smaller than himself. I think there's another truth here, too. In a sense, it doesn't even have to do with Hemingway. It has to do with us. Namely, that his life, which is to say the way he lived it, or our perception of the way he lived it, has always had the capacity to stir up complex things, to make us uneasy, defensive, secretly troubled about our own far less glamorous and more sedentary selves. He led a life of action in the physical world, all right, but underneath that was a bookish man in glasses trying to get his work done and finding it harder with each passing year. Scribner, Hemingway's publisher, reports that in 2010, his books sold 350,000 copies in North America alone. He exists iconically. He is sitting there on the back of our national eyeball, and all you need to do is go to the work itself, and then you'll understand all over again why he endures. Pick up The Sun Also Rises, 60,000 lyrical words that he wrote straight off in something like 7 weeks in 1925 at age 26. The world had a new kind of writing on its hands, painterly, in the way of an impressionist canvas. I think we are only just beginning to see how deep and slyly understanding the famous misogynist Ernest Hemingway always was of the female psyche. What I am trying to say is that the work backs up every bit of the man, and the man seems to reinvent himself for us in this new century. So what we have of this man are some irresolvable contradictions of the life and the glories of the work, some of it. The Hemingway myth, however much oversold and devalued, can still powerfully stand in this new century for a great many tensions unresolved in American males, or so I believe, and not only males. I also believe that all of Hemingway's writing, every bit of it, even at its most self-parodistic and papa cult worst, is seeking to be about the living of this life, the being of this life, the doing of this life, the engaging of this life. And in that sense, the work, and even, I am willing to say, so much of the coarsened personal history can be thought of as something spiritual and indeed almost holy. I would like to try to come to the end of this by reading a little of Hemingway's own words. They may be words you have never heard before. Loop backward 17 days from his death to June 15th, 1961, at Rochester, Minnesota. A man in the psychiatric ward of St. Mary's Hospital at Mayo Clinic is writing a letter to a 9-year-old boy. The man writes it on 2 small sheets of notepaper in his big, round, legible hand with his trademark downhill slant. An irreversibly damaged Ernest Hemingway, his inner landscape now a paranoid's nightmare, has found within himself, at the end of his life, the kindness and courage and momentary lucidity, not to say literary grace, to write 210 beautiful words to a kid he likes very much. Whenever I begin to feel revulsion at Hemingway's ego and boorish behavior toward other human beings, I like to take out a copy of this letter. 210 words with so much emotion tucked below the surface of the prose, the sentences pile-driven by contained feeling and acute observation of the natural world, would have been a half-decent output for a workday, even in a master's prime. This boy, his name is Frederick G. Saviors, although everyone, including Hemingway, calls him Fritz, has a congenital heart condition. He is the son of George Saviors, who is Hemingway's small-town doctor in Ketchum, and who is also one of Hemingway's favorite duck hunting companions. In these last weeks, Hemingway has been brought once more for treatment to Mayo Clinic. Not long after this note to Fritz, Hemingway will fool his foolish doctors at the world-famous clinic into believing he is well enough to go home to Idaho. And almost immediately, the shotgun will go off in the Sunday morning quiet of the house that sits a couple hundred yards up the steep slope from the west bank of the pebble-smooth Bigwood River. The patient on the locked ward at St. Mary's Hospital has just learned that Dr. Savior's son is in a Denver hospital. In Idaho, Hemingway and Fritz's dad liked talking about the Yankees and rainbow trout. But none of that will ever be the same again. St. Mary's Hospital, Rochester, Minnesota, June 15th, 1961. Dear Fritz, I was terribly sorry to hear this morning in a note from your father that you were laid up in Denver for a few days more, and speed off this note to tell you how much I hope you'll be feeling better. It has been very hot and muggy here in Rochester, but the last 2 days it has turned cool and lovely, with the nights wonderful for sleeping. The country is beautiful around here, and I've had a chance to see some wonderful country along the Mississippi where they used to drive the logs in the old lumbering days, and the trails where the pioneers came north. Saw some good bass jumping in the river. I never knew anything about the upper Mississippi before, and it is really a very beautiful country, and there are plenty of pheasants and ducks in the fall, but not as many as in Idaho. And I hope we'll both be back there shortly and can joke about our hospital experiences together. Best always to you, old-timer, from your good friend who misses you very much, Mr. Papa. P.S. Best to all the family. Am feeling fine and very cheerful about things in general, and hope to see you all very soon. No one knows for sure, but these seem to be the last real sentences Ernest Hemingway set down on paper. Amid so much ruin, still the beauty. Thank you very much.
I read a quote that Faulkner, who I don't particularly like, said of Hemingway, who I really like, that he thought he was dishonest. And it intrigued me. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard it completely. You're referring to a letter that Faulkner wrote and said Hemingway was dishonest. Yeah, that's a sort of famous moment. Occurred in the early 1950s. Faulkner won the Nobel Prize 4 years before Hemingway. That would have smarted. Faulkner wrote Hemingway after that, the follow-up, and said that it was way too raw that he didn't mean it in the way that it came out. Scholars have really tried to pick that apart. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that two gigantic egos were battling it out. I don't think that Faulkner truly thought Hemingway was dishonest, or vice versa. In fact, Hemingway at one point said, "Old Corncob Bill is the best of all of us." Yes, ma'am. It's coming right to you.
I read something recently, I believe written by Hemingway's editor, about the end of his life when he was paranoid and believed he was on CIA lists or FBI lists. And what I read was that he was on those lists. Do you have any information on that?
Yes, I do, and I talk about that in this book. And it wasn't Hemingway's editor, it was A.E. Hotchner, and he wrote it in the New York Times. And Hotchner was a whole generation younger than Hemingway, and he's a controversial figure in Hemingway studies. He is alternately viewed, and it has been said in print that he was Hemingway's toady. But Hemingway did seem, toward the end of his life, to want to confide a lot in A.E. Hotchner, who wrote a famous book called Papa Hemingway, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller. But that doesn't get to the heart of your question. The simplest answer, ma'am, might be the old bumper sticker, "Even paranoids have enemies." The truth is this. The truth is this. Hemingway, as we now know down the long barrel of history, had been watched by the FBI from the mid-30s onward, from his involvement in the Spanish Civil War. J. Edgar Hoover couldn't abide Hemingway. The supposedly abstemious J. Edgar Hoover thought that he was a womanizer and a drunk, and that would have started him right off hating Hemingway. There are dispatches written by agents in Havana to Washington, and there are direct dispatches from Hoover himself. The fully declassified Hemingway file, which still has its redactions, is as long as your arm. When Hemingway was in Mayo Clinic and getting shock treatments, the FBI agents were getting reports from Dr. Howard Rome, who was Hemingway's chief psychiatrist. So yes, he was wildly paranoid that the FBI was combing through his bank accounts on Saturday night in Ketchum near the end of his life, when they're sitting in a restaurant and he sees the lights on in the bank across the street, and he tells his wife and companion, see, they're going through our bank accounts. And he's clearly losing his mind, and his family's trying to calm him and say, no, that's just the cleaning ladies. Well, in fact, it was just the cleaning ladies, but this does not countermand the previous fact that in some weirdly clairvoyant way, he understood, and he knew, and he was right. Yes. Jeff Barg, old student, old beloved student. Been out of the university, out of my classes, 8, 9, 10 years. How are you, Jeff?
I'm good, thank you. How are you? I'm curious about both the writing process and the reporting process, and how it's different when you approach a subject who's already been so much more analyzed, so much more dissected than any, certainly more so than even Robert McNamara or James Meredith, other people who you've tackled in previous books.
Well, it's daunting, and I worried and say forthrightly in the prologue and I said it here tonight, that we've had far too many biographies. I knew that if I was going to try to go there, I would want to go in a new way, a different way. I'll take back the word new. I'm not sure anything is new, but that I wanted to try to do something a little unconventional. What I have written, Jeff, is not a biography as much as an interpretation and evocation and evocation. It's a long, complicated process. I mentioned in these remarks that this book probably goes back through 3 decades and 4 intervening projects. When Seal and I met Les Hemingway on a Grumman Goose seaplane on our way over to Bemini in 1980, I was an amateur Hemingway student by then, but other books intervened, and then in 1987, and that. I'm trying to avoid tangents here. I was stuck on another book about Robert McNamara, and I crawled back to the Washington Post to reclaim my family's broken finances, and didn't even know if I could write journalism again. And I had in my back pocket, you might say, the memory of having met Les Hemingway on Bimini in 1980, 2 years before Les Hemingway himself shot himself with a borrowed pistol in the foyer of his Miami Beach home. And so I went into my editor, wishing to prove myself somehow, having returned to the Washington Post and feeling immense failure about the McNamara Vietnam project. And I said, Mary, Papa's Boys, Hemingway's 3 sons. And she sort of looked at me blankly and said, yes, so? I said, I wonder if I could go find them. I wonder if anybody's exactly done that. And she said, she staked me to it, and so I did it. All of these things were gestating inside me, Jeff. I knew that if I were going to embark on this project, I would need some kind of organizing principle. Before I went in search of Hemingway's sons, I had bought Carlos Baker's Letters of Ernest Hemingway, which is a 984-page tome, and you can't read that book from page 404, I think it is, onward, and not be consciously or unconsciously, half-consciously aware of the word boat or aware of the name Pilar, because he has just bought her at that point. So was something psychologically and subconsciously gnawing on me. And one way or another, the book began to form itself. And in the meantime, these other books got written in fits and starts with my beloved editor, John Siegel, who's here. And then I came back to it. And I remember saying to John, it can't be a biography, and much less can it be the history of a nautical piece of floating wood. Pilar has to be some kind of metaphor for an overstory. And you find it as you go along. That's part of the answer, and I wish the answer were better. Yes, ma'am.
You referred to the many women in Hemingway's life. In your work, did you find that one particular one had more influence or meant more to him than the others? And also, do you think that Pilar was perhaps another woman in his life?
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful question, ma'am, and it has so many parts to it. Can I preface the answer by embarrassing someone in the audience? I just caught you out of the corner of my eye, Linda. There is a Hemingway scholar in the room who has forgotten more about Ernest Hemingway than I will ever know. Her name is Linda Patterson Miller, and from the first, she was supportive and accepting of me. We both lived, actually, briefly in the same town of Havertown, Pennsylvania, and she said, well, I'm willing to move. There can't be two Hemingway people living in the same town. She didn't exactly say that, but that's the narrative I've imposed on our friendship. This was about 7 or 8 years ago. Linda Patterson Miller is a Penn State University professor, and her husband is a professor at St. Joseph's University, and they're both here tonight. And Linda is, without exaggeration, a internationally recognized Hemingway scholar. I bring this up not solely to embarrass her, but to come at your answer by saying this. Early on, I began to recognize that I was seeming to get more understanding about Hemingway from women, from female Hemingway scholars than men. And that was the first clue to me that things would not necessarily be as they always seemed regarding the, as I said, famous misogynist Ernest Hemingway. You asked if Pilar could have been a woman in his life. Pilar is a character in For Whom the Bell Tolls. She is a stolid, ungainly, solid, masculine force of the revolution, of the loyalists fighting against Franco's fascists. So she literally is a character. He loved the name Pilar. Of his 4 wives, I sort of obliquely in my remarks talked about the fact that he was married 4 times. They were, in this order, Hadley, Pauline, Martha, and Mary. It's my belief, and I'd love to hear Linda say something about it. Linda has taught me so much, but there's so much that we haven't talked about. But I think, in my view, that Hemingway's first wife, Hadley, was his truest love, or at least his truest marriage. And that the scratch him at his deepest base, the Protestant Midwestern boy from Oak Park never forgave himself for allowing wife number 2, who was Pauline, to come in and pretend herself as the third-party best friend of Hadley, and wanting all the while to steal this incredibly, there he is, to steal him away. And then the third wife, Marty Gellhorn, who was much younger than Hemingway and was a writer. And that was the shortest marriage, really only 3 or 4 years. They were married 5. And then his last wife, Mary, with whom he had a very fraught, difficult relationship, and yet his longest marriage, from March of 1946 until he committed suicide. There were many women in Hemingway's life, and I was only saying a little snippet of what I deeply feel, that I think we are just beginning to understand how slyly understanding he was of the female psyche. Here's the thing. Early Hemingway scholarship tended to suggest that the women in Hemingway's fiction exist as sexual objects. They are doormats. They exist to please their men. when you burrow down into the stories and the novels, you begin to find something different. A Farewell to Arms, which he wrote when he was 29 years old. It was published. I mean, he was 30 when it was published. He was a world figure on the literary stage. Catherine Barclay in that story is now beginning to be seen as a heroic person, someone who has more maturity, more stoicism, who dies in childbirth. His portrait of her is not one-dimensional. I think all too quickly, and Hemingway set himself up for it so much. I'm not denying any of that. That early Hemingway scholarship wanted to really think of him as the worst kind of male chauvinist pig. One of my great hopes in the doing of this book is that my own bride of 32 years, been married to Seal as long as I've been, quote, married to John Siegel, my editor, that Seal will somehow, at the end, feel he is less of the chauvinist than she previously thought he was. But the jury is still out because I sort of surreptitiously notice where the bookmark is.
Paul, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you could just take us in the other direction or show us the sort of flip side here. You've given us that lovely and redemptive letter to Fritz that comes at the end of your book. What would be the corresponding document or moment for you, maybe in your researches and your thinking about Hemingway, that was most horrifying or repulsive? The place where you felt like this isn't a figure I want to redeem. Was there such a moment?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Jim. I don't think we should press this man's case for canonization in Rome. He wrote some of the vilest letters imaginable. He saved them for his own typewriter, his own hand. We're in very polite company, aren't we? So maybe I could just read you a little snatch of a letter. James Jones from Here to Eternity, a Scribner author. And Charlie Scribner, after Max Perkins died, who was Hemingway's great editor, Charlie Scribner, the head of the Scribner publishing family, became, by default, Hemingway's editor. He had the bad form, so to speak, to send Hemingway the galleys of this young upstart's new novel called From Here to Eternity, which was a war novel. But wait a minute, Hemingway owned war. How dare anybody else try to write about the subject of war? This is a little of it. Get ready. How unthinking of Charlie Scribner to have done this, thinking that maybe Ernest would be outside himself enough to write a blurb, a nice quote. About the James Jones book, it is not great no matter what they tell you. To me, he is an enormously skillful fuck-up, and his book will do great damage to our country. Probably I should reread it again to give you a truer answer, but I do not have to eat an entire bowl of scabs to know that they are scabs, nor to suck a boil to know it is a boil, nor swim through a river of snot to know it is snot. I hope he kills himself as soon as it does no damage to your sales. If you give him a literary tea, you might ask him to drain a bucket of snot and then suck the pus out, but I can't read the rest of it. could I circle back to a question my old student Jeff asked about how these things evolve? Sarah, do we have that other photograph? I know this is beginning to seem like performance art, and Jim is going to cut this off any second now. Don't put it up yet. We were going to do this, and then we were not going to do this, so don't put it up yet. But I gave, Jim doesn't know about this. What's going on? I gave Sarah Varney and Jennifer a bunch of the slides that were showing as you all filed in, and their pictures in the book. I also gave them an old curling photograph that my wife took. And I'd like to show it to you. 1980, Bimini. I've got my arm around Ernest Hemingway. Not exactly. Where is that picture? Can you get it? Look at Paul. Yeah. That's me. That's when I was a young, healthy man. That's less Hemingway. He was a sad man for all the, hanging out on Bimini where his brother, 16 years older, had conquered tuna and marlin. And here's Les Hemingway. But he turned out to be an uncommonly nice man. And he was an old journalist. And he had done a stint at the Miami Herald, and perhaps that's why we bonded, I'm not sure. He was the first one who began telling me these stories that seemed absolutely incredulous. He said, well, my nephew, Gigi, is a cross-dresser. And I said, really? Gregory Hemingway was a medical doctor by then, but had not yet had transgendering surgery. But he told me all sorts of things like that. And so Jeff, these things were happening inside me. And tonight in 2011, I'm standing here with this old curling photograph and a book that I feel just damned lucky to have gotten done. Maybe like one or two more, or are we ready to stop?
There's one more question, and then we'll at the table outside where you can purchase books and get them signed for a little while. One more? Right there?
Oh, just a voice from the
Here comes the mic.
A voice from the ignorant as far as Hemingway is concerned. There's a thought that comes to my mind. It came from someone who was not like Hemingway at all, but had some of his characteristics. It was Benito Mussolini, who said, rather one day a lion than 100 years a lamb. And that makes me think, I'm probably wrong, that Hemingway had planned to end his life when, as far as he was concerned, he was no longer a lion. And that the day that you spoke of, that Sunday, spoke of so eloquently, was long planned by Hemingway because he saw his lion days ended. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, that's a heck of a note to end on, but I don't know much about Mussolini. The quote is resonant and haunting to me. I don't believe he planned that Sunday morning. I believe he was, his inner landscape was a paranoid's nightmare. But where I will meet you, sir, with common ground, is that you can thread through his letters and you can find so much his talk about may have to shoot myself. The thought of self-destruction did trail him. Linda Patterson Miller, whom I embarrassed earlier, I think would want to stress the fact that it's too easy and cheap and vulgar even to make the Hemingway fatalistic doomed story. That's the easy narrative. It's the cheap way out. I think he was so sick and he could no longer live on his own terms. Here is a terribly sad fact. in this middle class, Protestant, suburban Chicago family of 8, mother, father, and 6 kids, 4 died by their own hand, and maybe a 5th. That's a heck of a note to end on. Thank you very much.